Hey yo, in this video I'm going to go over the top 10 tips that I wish I knew when I was getting started, the golden nuggets of information, the ultimate hacks, the techniques, the tips, the tricks, you get it. These tips are going to be revolved around recording, production, and mixing. So they're kind of like a hodgepodge of those three subjects, but just the best tips that I have learned over the years, condensed into 10 awesome, actionable things that you can learn and apply in your home studio and your music productions today. Hey yo, it's Alex from Metamind Music, and with this channel it's my mission to help musicians produce themselves by developing their mindset, expanding their creativity, and connecting to their inner artist in a deeper way. Alright, before we jump into the top 10 tips, I want to start with number 0, which is kind of a pre-tip for all of these other tips. Alright, and tip number 0 is to really focus on pre-production before you get into recording or before you decide to produce and record a song for its final form or the one that you plan on releasing. I've listened to interviews with many producers, I've talked to other producers, I've been in many studios, and I've asked about what is the biggest mistake, the biggest struggle that you face when recording other bands, other artists when they come in the studio. And invariably the answer is the musicians that come into the studio are not prepared enough, okay? They didn't do enough what is called pre-production. So the importance of pre-production is if you're going to a professional studio or even if you're planning on recording your album at home, that you get all of the kinks worked out with the songwriting, with the parts, with the different kinds of tones and the sonic soundscapes, the lyrics, the song structure is all 100% figured out before you go ahead to the recording phase. The reason for this is once you get into a professional studio setting where you're paying by the hour for a professional's time, you really want to make the most out of the time you have there and the expertise of the people you're working with. And the way that these professionals and experts will help you make the most out of your songs is if you have them completed to the best of your abilities ahead of time, so then they can have ideas that are more on a higher level, more on a sonic level, maybe on an arrangement level or performance level, but not figuring out what you have to play, figuring out what the song is in the studio. Same goes for if you're doing this at home. Before you start thinking about recording your song and committing final parts, getting good tones, good source sounds, and recording what you plan to release to the world, you should probably have a really good sounding demo of what the song looks like in the big picture, so then you can make those best decisions before you start the recording process. And of course, a lot of us are working at a home studio and we do everything, and the lines will blur between these things. You might start recording ideas as you're producing the song, and then some of those parts you might use in the final mix, and they kind of intertwine. But it's always handy to have this headspace and to separate the process into pre-production and then production to make the most out of your efforts. All right, so tip number 0 is just focus on pre-production and try to get great sounding demos before you commit to the recording phase. All right, number 1 is to create what I like to call scratch tracks or click tracks for each and every of your songs with guitar or bass and whatever else is crucial to the song structure. And this is typically if you're recording, let's say, a band or a drummer. Well, while you're recording the drummer has to listen to something that is in time and that gives him enough feel and enough vibe for him to have a good performance. So that's if you would be, let's say, recording drums first, but let's say you're recording guitars and bass first or something. You could actually program drum parts to have some sort of flavor, some sort of groove, to then record your bass and guitar tracks to that program drum, and then go ahead and use those polished, awesome sounding guitar and bass takes to record the drums afterwards. And the whole reason to create this like click track and this like scratch track to record to is to make sure everything you record is in time and following the same pulse. And if you get into editing performances later, you're gonna have a steady pulse and a grid that you're gonna be able to inch your parts closer towards to really tighten up the whole recording. Unless you're a band that is extremely tight together or the nature of your music does not require or does not benefit from a click track, I highly encourage you to create a click track for all of your songs before recording them. All right, tip number 2 is like this mini checklist for recording drums. All right, number 1, you want to record in a good sounding room. So you want to put your drummer and the drum kit in a room, and you literally want to ask the drummer, all right, play a beat from a song that you want to record, and stand in the room and listen to how it sounds, right? And this is the greatest place to start from, to hear how the room sounds with those drums, and whether there are too many resonances, whether something is lost, whether something sounds too harsh, and start making decisions from that foundation. All right, so generally you want to make sure that you're miking your drum kit properly. You want to make sure that you are checking for phase. You want to check for phasing, and then you want to listen for general quality control. So you want to listen to your drum heads. Are they in tune? Do they sound good when they're hit? Or do you need to replace those drum heads? Same goes for the kick drum. When the drummer plays the kick drum, does it sound airy and tight, or does it resonate? Does it sound woofy? Does it sound flat and muddy? All right, the more you can pinpoint what might be the issues ahead of time, the more you can adjust your mic positions, you can stuff material inside the kick drum, you can tune your drum heads, you can move mics around the room, and you can make all these adjustments ahead of time. And the more time you focus ahead of time to get awesome sounding drums from the room itself, from the drums themselves, and the microphone placement, the easier it is to make them sound great in the mix later. All right, tip number 3 is to use room mics, and this goes for drums, or this goes for anything that you want to add more ambience to. Like, for example, if let's say you rented a room to record drums in and you have access to this big, awesome sounding room, you definitely want to make sure that you place some room mics in that room to capture the ambience of the space. Same goes for, let's say, recording a guitar amp in a room. You might want to put a microphone somewhere else in the room to capture some ambience and get some really organic sounding reverb. And usually for vocals, you want to record an isolated source, so you want to eliminate the ambient noise as much as possible. Although you can play around with using resonances and using room spaces to really give a unique character to your vocal recording. So summed up, tip number 3 is experiment with room mics and mic placement, because you'd be surprised how putting a microphone in some obscure place while you're recording can actually give some unique character in the mix once you mix it in at a lower volume with the original sound source. All right, and tip number 4 is to edit your performances. And this is a caveat. This is very dependent on the skill and the performance that you capture of the various parts, various musicians that you're recording. You want to use your discretion depending on the type of sound and the type of music you are recording 100%, but we have gotten used to hearing tight performances that are in tune with all the music we listen to these days. So if you record something that is out of time and you don't edit it, or if you record something out of tune and you don't retrack it, it's going to be perceived as less high quality than everything else we're used to hearing. For example, if you're recording a drummer, you're most likely going to have to go in to the nitty-gritty details and edit the audio of all the tracks to get closer to the grid of the click track you recorded to. And the whole point of this is not to reduce the humanness and reduce the feel out of the performance, because some people do that. Some people will edit the performance perfectly to the grid, and it just sounds like robots. You might as well just be making electronic music. On the flip side of that, I've very rarely met a drummer that can play perfectly to a click track without falling off it a little bit. And sometimes it takes a little bit of editing to then have something that has a consistent pulse so that everything else can be recorded to that consistent pulse. And typically for bass or guitars or vocals, I like to do what is called editing on the go. And instead of recording huge vocal takes or huge guitar takes and then editing it later, I like to take little takes of the song and make sure that those takes are in time and sounding good, and just go chunk by chunk all along the song itself, and it'll save you so much more time, and it will make your performances that much more tight. And this obviously varies depending on the performance ability of the musician or yourself, if you're recording yourself, to how tight you can track takes. If you can track a whole song in one go and it's perfectly tight, go ahead and do that. But if you can't do that, there's no shame in recording smaller chunks at a time to make sure you're getting the most out of your performance. All right, tip number 5 is spending the time up front to get awesome source sounds. And what do I mean by this is that a lot of people tend to think that you can just record something and then make it sound good later in the DAW with plugins and some awesome magic to make it sound awesome. But this is actually the wrong approach. The best approach to take is to capture the best possible sounding tones right off the bat and then just enhancing them later in the mix. All right, so this means experimenting with different amps, different mic placement, different vocal mics, different bass plugins, different bass pedals, whatever it may be, and really take the time up front to fine tune the tone before you commit to recording the song. And to expand on this, you also want to make sure that your instruments are in good condition so that they stay in tune. They have new strings if you're playing a stringed instrument. They have new drum heads if they need new drum heads. And you're spending the time up front to make sure that your instrument actually sounds good when you're recording it and that it stays in tune between takes. This is crucial. If I'm recording guitar for myself or recording someone else, it is not unlikely for me to check the tuning after every take or after every couple takes. So definitely take that seriously. All right, tip number 6 is kind of optional. It's something you can play with, but it's experimenting with recording different parts first and different parts second and third. So typically if you were recording a band or something, you would record the drummer to a click, and then you record the bass, and then you might record the guitars, and then the vocals, and then mix all that together, add anything else afterwards. However, there's a lot of awesome results you can get from flipping that around. What if you recorded guitars first, and then bass, and then drums? All right, this will change your approach. For example, typically if you record a drummer first, once the drum parts are recorded, that is it. You're not changing anything, and then you're stacking the bass, and then you're stacking the guitar, or whatever it may be. If you flip the script and you're good, but if you flip the script and you record guitars first, and then bass, and then drums, well, the drummer now has time to adjust his parts, adjust his performance relative to what the guitars and the bass have laid down, and it will give you a different end result of the final recording. The practical way to use this is if you record drums and then guitar and then bass last, it's a lot easier to adjust the tuning of the bass if needed if the guitar is out of tune, rather than the other way around. If the bass is out of tune, it's going to be extremely hard to adjust the tuning of a whole 6-string guitar playing chords and whatnot to fit with the bass that might be out of tune. Tip number 7 is always record a bass DI signal, and this can also go for guitar as well. However, if you're recording a bass amp, if you're recording a bassist, always get a DI recording. Okay, because the reason for this is in the mixing process, you're most likely going to need a DI to use for the low end of the bass. All right, if you record a DI track, it's going to have a more consistent low end than if you're recording just a bass amp, all right? And a lot of the times in the mixing phase, you're going to mix part of the bass amp and part of the bass DI as 2 separate tracks to then make your ultimate bass tone. It's also very important to track DI in case the amp tone is unusable. You can always use the DI track at a later date, and this is where it crosses over with guitar as well. So if you're recording a guitar amp and not recording DI, that is all you have to work with, all right? And if for some reason the guitar amp tone isn't working with your mix, it isn't working with the other tones that you've recorded, now you don't have another way out. But if you record a guitar DI track, you could now use that guitar DI with an awesome amp sim, or you could use it to reamp the guitar signal through a different amp or a different miking technique with the same amp, whatever it may be, to then recapture the tone from that same performance to help you in the mix. All right, so when you have the opportunity and you think about it, definitely opt in for capturing a DI of either bass or guitar as you're recording. All right, tip number 8 is if you're looking for a really powerful drum sound in your mix, you're going to want to use those room mics we talked about, and you're going to want to be very heavy-handed with the compression on those room mics. And what this is going to do is it's going to really compress the sound of the room ambience, and it's going to bring it up in your mix. And if you compress that sound of the room ambience and becomes a lot more audible, it's going to add a lot of that explosion factor to the snare, to the toms, even to the overheads by mixing it in with that expanded ambience in your mix. For an extra tip, if you use a technique called parallel compression, which is basically setting up an auxiliary channel with some pretty extreme compression on it, but then sending parts of certain signals to that channel, you could also send your room mics to that parallel compression along with maybe some kick and snare to really get like a super powerful explosive drum sound with some simple mixing techniques. All right, tip number 9 is make sure your vocal performances are committed and are in tune as much as possible. All right, and what do I mean by committed is just vocals most typically is the most easy thing to connect to in music. It's typically what people resonate with the most in various songs. It's very easy to emotionally connect to a vocal performance, and if the vocal performance is lacking that emotive quality, is lacking emotion, is lacking commitment in the performance, it's going to be lackluster in the end result. So if ever you're recording your vocals or you're recording a vocalist, try your best to create the space to maybe encourage the vocalist or encourage yourself, get pumped up to really get a committed performance when you're recording vocal takes. All right, because if you can really try to emote what you're trying to express with the tone of your voice, with the expression of the syllables and the lyrics, it's going to make a huge difference in the end result of your mix. All right, tip number 10 is don't use too much reverb when you're mixing. And this is something that a lot of beginners tend to do, because when we're mixing, we tend to listen to things in solo. And then if you're listening to something in solo and you add reverb to it, it's gonna sound better. Like almost everything sounds better with reverb and some ambience, some space. And you're like, oh, this adds a lot of like depth, a lot of like texture. This is awesome. The only problem with this is if you do this with different reverbs, with different tracks, and you're adding to all these different ambiences in your mix, the end result is going to be just a cluttered, cloudy, muddy mess of reverb without any actual depth or impact. All right, so in most cases, okay, unless you're really getting into the fine tuning of the reverb tails, or you're trying to do something epic like Pink Floyd, or you're like really going on a sonic adventure with like an electronic production and you're really getting into the nitty gritty of the reverb, you're gonna want to use less reverb than you think. You're gonna wanna use it sparingly because it's very, very easy to overdo it with reverb, whether it be on vocals, on vocal harmonies, on guitar leads, on drums, on drum rooms, on keyboards, right? It's very easy to get carried away with reverb, and a lot of the time the end result will only cloud your final mix. So if you can actually limit the amount of reverb you are going to use intentionally, and you intentionally focus on what you're going to decide is going to have more ambience in the mix, going to have more dimension, it's going to have more impact in the end result of your mix. All right, so that wraps it up for my top 10 tips that I have discovered over the years in recording, producing, mixing, all that fun jazz. I hope you found them useful. And hey, if you're just getting started with music production or having trouble finishing projects, or would just like to see a glimpse inside my personal workflow, I've created an easy to follow 7-step framework that takes you from your very first ideas through all of its various changes and experimentations and moving it all the way to a finished project and a finished mix and master. Super easy to follow. I've injected it full of awesome recording and mixing tips that I've learned over the years, and it's super handy to have around your studio as a printout. So if you're interested, you can find that in the link below. And hey, what are the best recording, producing, mixing tips that you have learned along the years on your journey? Leave them in the comment below. I'd love to start a conversation and learn about what are the best tips, strategies that you've learned on your journey. And until the next video, we'll see you in the next one.